The FBI currently lists more than 300 fugitives that it's searching for, both in the US and abroad. Other criminals remain unnamed, their identities a mystery years or even decades after their crimes. Other criminals make most wanted lists elsewhere in the US, with disturbing crimes that remain in the minds of those who witnessed them. Number 5. On September 25, 2020, Meredith Burns reported her husband as missing. He would soon be wanted by the FBI for stealing more than $12 million. He's still a wanted fugitive today. From the outside, the Burnses seemed to be the perfect family. Christopher W. Burns was a 36-year-old financial advisor living in Berkeley Lake, Georgia, with his wife and 3 children. Those inside the house knew that there were some difficulties, but couldn't imagine the terrible situation they would soon find themselves in. Christopher had met Meredith through the church when they were both still at school. They became friends first, then began dating when Meredith was at college. They married in 2002 and welcomed the first addition to their family a year later. Christopher started his professional career as a youth pastor in Indianapolis before the family moved back to Georgia. There, he worked at the same church his father had been a pastor, a megachurch known as Perimeter Church. But in 2011, Christopher decided to take up a new career. He started out as a life insurance salesman, then joined a financial firm. Christopher excelled in his career. He was brilliant at winning the trust of others, and it was a skill that would eventually allow him to commit his terrible crime. According to Christopher's family, he became focused on being more successful and earning more money. He set up finance firms and offered advice to people. He bought airtime on a local radio station and started a weekly show. The Chris Burns Show looked at headlines from the week and told listeners how the news would impact them and their money. Online, he talked about how he saw people who feared they would never be able to retire, and how he wanted to give them the life his grandparents had enjoyed when they retired. Burns' fame grew. He was invited onto TV shows to talk about finances, and was sought out by clients who were looking for help to become as successful as he was. He definitely seemed to have that success. By 2020, he had 3 children, 2 teenage sons, and a young daughter. He took regular trips to Disney parks with the family, visiting the parks at least twice a year, and treating the family to vacations on Disney cruise ships. On one occasion, Burns paid for the neighbors to visit the park with them. On another, he paid for a VIP tour that cost $8,000 per day. If their Disney trips didn't make it obvious that they were financially successful, the family also had an expensive lake house and boat. But in the summer of 2020, Meredith noticed a change in her husband. He told her there was an audit going on at his company, and then said that a federal agency was getting involved. The agency was the Securities and Exchange Commission, or the SEC, but Burns told her that they were only involved because COVID meant everything was backed up. He would eventually confess that it was an investigation but didn't go into details. On September 24th, he told Meredith he was going to visit his parents. Shortly before he vanished, he made Meredith go with him to a UPS store and sign some paperwork. She thought it was the first stages of a separation. That was a little strange, but Chris was extremely stressed and Meredith was feeling unwell, so she went ahead with it. She thought that they would talk about it properly when he returned from his parents. Chris left in Meredith's car, as that would be more suitable for the drive in the stormy conditions. On his way, he stopped by the school that his 2 sons attended. He found them in the band room where they were practicing for a performance coming up that weekend. They were both in the school band and would be performing at the football game at halftime. Chris had come to drop off his oldest son's letter jacket. When his son asked him to help him get a drum pad from another room, he said he didn't have enough time and quickly left. It was the last time any of his family would see him. Between 9:30 and 9:35 p.m. that evening, Chris's closest relatives received messages from him. The messages were sent to his brother, parents, Meredith, his daughter's birth mother, and one of his sons. It's believed he simply forgot to send a message to his other son rather than deliberately excluding him. He told Meredith he loved her and asked her to pray for him. That was a little strange, as Chris had been open about being an atheist in recent years, but Meredith was too tired to pick up on the comment. Instead, she sent a message saying that she would and went to bed. The next day, September 25th, Chris was supposed to hand over documents to the SEC. Meredith didn't know this, but she figured that something was wrong when he didn't respond to her calls or texts. She called his parents, only to discover that they hadn't heard from Chris at all, and he hadn't been planning a trip as far as they knew. Chris was reported missing the same day, though the police didn't initially take the case too seriously. They believed he would be back soon. Meredith used an app to locate her car in a parking garage in Dunwoody. There was no sign of Chris there. He had left behind copies of some cashier's checks and life insurance paperwork. It soon became clear that this wasn't a simple missing person case. Chris was a fugitive. For years, he'd been running a Ponzi scheme. He promoted low-risk investment notes. People would give him money, and he told them it would be lent to small businesses that needed investments. They would get their money back and interest, as much as 20% on top. The loans were extremely safe, he claimed, and he would guarantee it. The money was being used to fund his lifestyle, though. There were no small businesses, and most of the people who bought these promissory notes never saw their money again. Chris used some of that money to pay early investors to make it seem like this was a good idea, but when he disappeared, he owed millions of dollars. Meredith also discovered that she and Chris were now completely divorced. He had made her sign a divorce settlement, which gave her most of their shared estates, including the boat and their home. She would also learn of a mistress that he had living in Vegas. He would frequently claim to be going on work trips, only to go and see her. Meredith had no idea about the scheme Chris had been running, but there were signs leading up to his disappearance that something wasn't right. He would frequently miss appointments, claiming he was caught up at work and missed the time. On one occasion, she found items that appeared to be illegal substances in his car. They'd been going to counseling together and things seemed to be moving in a positive direction. But at home, Chris was controlling and manipulative. It was only after he disappeared that Meredith realized what he had been doing to her and their family. The investigation into his Ponzi scheme continued after he disappeared. Meredith and the rest of the Burns family cooperated with the investigation and knew nothing about what he was doing. Chris Burns and the companies he operates have been ordered to pay $12 million back in stolen money, and there's a class action lawsuit against him brought by the people he stole from. In October of 2020, an arrest warrant for mail fraud was also issued. FBI investigators believe Burns is still alive and still in the United States. The FBI describes Burns as being 6'2", about 240 pounds, with brown hair and brown eyes. He has a tattoo on his left forearm of 3 black triangles interlaced. Anyone with information about Burns' location is asked to contact the FBI's Atlanta field office at 770-216-3000 or their local FBI office. Number 4. In 2018, the FBI announced that they were looking for a number of hackers believed to be responsible for countless intrusions around the world. Among them was a 41-year-old Sergei Morgachev, who remains one of the FBI's most wanted cyber criminals. Morgachev was a member of a group of hackers known by many names. They include APT28, Fancy Bear, and others. After careful investigation work, it was discovered that the group was part of the GRU, a Russian intelligence agency, and had the official unit number 26165. The group was formed at some point in the early 2000s and managed to move relatively undetected until 2014. During that time, it targeted countless organizations and individuals. The group likely started out targeting individuals. In particular, under threat were Russian citizens who spoke out against Russia, and journalists that were not seen as friendly to the Kremlin. The purpose of the attacks was to simply gather information on the subjects. It would often be impossible for the subjects to know that they'd even been hacked. They would go about their everyday business while correspondence, personal information, and passwords were secreted away. When the group was finally discovered, it was believed at first that APT28 was simply there to open doors. They would brute force their way into as many systems or computers as possible, and then pass on the information to other units within GRU, who would be able to implement more targeted attacks. As more information was learned about the unit, it was clear that they were dangerous on their own, and Morgachev was a big part of that danger. By late December of 2014, APT28 was targeting major organizations. One of the first was the German parliament. In May of 2015, the IT infrastructure at Bundestag was completely struck down. As many as 20,000 computers in the building were infected, with malware taking information from the devices. It wasn't until the entire parliament was taken offline for days that investigators were able to stop the attack. Almost immediately, hackers with connections to Russia were suspected. It emerged that they had gradually infected computers since December of 2014. APT28 would eventually be identified as the group responsible. The German parliament would be joined by a Ukraine military app, the World Anti-Doping Agency, and the International Olympic Committee as some of the others that were targeted by the group. The purpose of the attacks varied depending on the organization being targeted. Most of the time, it seemed like the main purpose was information gathering. Other times, the hackers wanted to take the organization or app offline. On April 8, 2015, a French television network was attacked. The first intrusion at TV5 Monday had happened in January but had gone unnoticed. For months, the attackers monitored the network, figuring out how its broadcasting systems worked. The hackers then chose the date that the network was launching a new channel to attack. At around 8:40 p.m. that night, all 12 channels were taken off the air, and the Facebook and Twitter accounts for TV5 Monday were displaying messages from an organization that claimed to be responsible for the attacks. The hack would have been devastating for TV5. According to Director General of the company, if the channels had been offline for any longer than they actually were, it could have led to satellite companies canceling contracts. The entire network could have gone under. As it was, because of the launch that day, there were engineers and technicians on site to manage the threat. By the early hours of April 9th, some channels had been restored, but the network staff had to resort to using fax machines for months afterward, as they could not connect to the internet. This time, the APT28 tried to blame another organization for its attack, but it wasn't long before investigators established the true origin. Why exactly TV5 had been attacked still isn't clear. It hadn't been particularly outspoken against Russia, and there wasn't anything that made it stand out against any other French channel. Investigators believe that it may have just been a test run to see if it could be done. So far, the crime hasn't been repeated with any other network. APT28 used styles of malware that were commonly used by more independent hackers, as well as state-backed organizations. It was an attempt to give the Russian military some deniability, but investigators were able to see through the attempt. The hacks were all found to originate from the same group of addresses, and there was only one group of people that would want to target all the individuals and organizations that were being hit by APT28. Determining exactly which group of hackers were responsible for which hacks was a little harder. There are many advanced persistent threat groups that are associated with the Russian military, but investigators finally connected APT28 with an actual unit. Unit 26165 is made up of at least 12 people, though it's believed many more may be working in the unit unidentified. The 12 were identified by a US grand jury in 2018, and were soon added to the FBI's most wanted cyber criminals list. Among those was Sergei Morgachev. Morgachev was a lieutenant colonel and a head of a department within Unit 26165. He was in charge of the team dedicated to developing and managing new malware. One of the most infamous pieces of malware the group developed was X-Agent, which collects and transmits files from the infected machine to the hackers. It was this piece of malware that the group used to hack the computers of US politicians and their staff members in 2016. And it was that hacking that first caught the attention of the FBI and made Unit 26165 famous around the world. 7 members of the unit were also indicted in October of 2018 for hacking into various anti-doping organizations, both in the US and internationally. Among those was Morgachev. Despite the attention, the unit has continued to hack into systems of other international organizations, including the Norwegian Parliament in 2020, and they don't seem to have slowed down at all. Like many other fugitives wanted by America, authorities know exactly where Morgachev is, but the likelihood of him ever being brought to justice is relatively low. The FBI warns that Morgachev should be considered armed and dangerous. Number 3. On November 8, 1971, New Mexico State Police Patrolman Robert Rosenblum said goodbye to his wife and 2 children for the final time. That evening, another officer would find his body at the side of the road. One of the people responsible for this disturbing crime is still wanted by the FBI. It was 10:41 p.m. when Officer Rosenblum called in a license plate to check if it was a stolen car. The car had California plates and was traveling on the I-40 near Albuquerque. Just 14 minutes passed between Rosenblum calling in the plate and a dispatcher radioing him with an update on the car. But the dispatcher got no response. Rosenblum had already been attacked. Rosenblum had pulled the car to the side of the road. Inside were 3 men. A passing motorist watched the police officer be sent flying into the air away from the car after a loud bang. He was struck with at least 1 bullet and the car sped away. A huge manhunt followed. It wasn't long before police found the car that Officer Rosenblum had pulled over. It was a rented Ford Galaxy sedan, and it was filled with weapons. The car had been abandoned, and the 3 men who had been inside were nowhere to be found. At some point during the investigation, they were identified as Michael Finney, Ralph Goodwin, and Charles Lee Hill. Today, only Hill is alive. Finney and Goodwin were from California, while Hill was from New Mexico. He was only 21 years old at the time. Some sources label him as a Vietnam War deserter, though Hill calls himself a veteran of the war. Like Officer Rosenblum, he had a young daughter at home that he would never see again, though that was a choice for Hill. The men knew that they couldn't stay in the New Mexico desert forever, and that the net was closing in around them. November 27th, and the manhunt was still underway and making headlines in the local area. Despite the terrible crime, it was a normal morning for Vic Duggar, owner of Duggar Wrecking Service in Albuquerque. He received a call about a car that wouldn't start, and took his tow truck out to help the stranded people. He pulled up to an address and spotted a man in the street, waving his arms to signal him. Almost as soon as he stopped the truck, there was a weapon pointed at Vic. The 3 fugitives piled into the tow truck and forced the driver to take them to nearby Albuquerque International Airport. The truck drove through the fence onto the runway, where a Boeing 727 was being prepared for takeoff. The plane was Trans World Airlines Flight 106, which had originated in Phoenix, Arizona, and was supposed to be traveling to Washington. A fueling truck was still attached to the plane when the 3 men rushed on with the last of the passengers. They were armed, and Hill put up a bladed weapon to the throat of one of the stewardesses. The crew later described the 3 criminals as being very calm. They knew what they wanted and where they wanted to go. The experience would have been terrifying. Despite the fears, though, the crew remained cool. There had been a relatively large number of cases of planes being taken over by criminals in the years before this took place, and the crew had a pretty good idea of what the criminals would request, even before they asked. At first, the men wanted to go to Africa. They were told that the plane wouldn't be able to make it to another continent. Then they requested Cuba. For years, Cuba had been taking in fugitives from the United States. Any extradition treaties between the 2 countries had broken down during the political upheaval in the island nation, and many wanted criminals were hiding out on the beaches of Havana. The taking of planes to travel to Cuba was so common that some airlines advertised how comfortable they would keep their passengers in the event of an unplanned trip to the nation. Flight attendants were supposedly trained to give tours and excursions. Hill and his 2 accomplices first requested they travel to Atlanta to refuel. That was then switched to Tampa, Florida. The plane landed at 7 a.m. and the passengers were let off. The plane was refueled even though it had already been given enough fuel to travel to Cuba and back. FBI agents wanted to go with the man who had volunteered to refuel the plane, but he wouldn't allow them. Instead, they had to watch the plane leave with the crew and fugitives on board. Hill and his accomplices hadn't asked for money, or parachutes like the infamous D.B. Cooper. This was a much simpler affair. The men just wanted to get out of the country. They knew that the crime could result in their own lives being taken if they stayed in New Mexico, and didn't believe that anywhere else in the US would be safe. Captain John B. McGee flew the plane to Havana, and the 3 fugitives were escorted off the plane by Cuban soldiers. The men were brought into custody, but they wouldn't remain there for long. Like the dozens of other US criminals who had fled to Cuba, Hill and his accomplices started new lives on the island nation. Goodwin passed away after an accident while swimming in 1973, but Hill and Finney grew old in the country. Cuba wasn't everything that Hill hoped it would be, though. He wanted to train to fight in Africa, but was refused permission. Instead, he got jobs working for the government. It wasn't terrible, but it wasn't everything he had imagined. He started a new family in Cuba, married twice and divorced twice. He had 2 young children, but there are some parts of America that he misses. For instance, he hasn't seen his daughter since he fled in 1971. She was just 6 years old when he vanished, and has children of her own now. With the easing of relations between Cuba and the United States in 2015, there was some fear that an extradition treaty might be put into place, but that never happened. Hill also claimed he would consider coming back to the United States if he could be assured a fair trial, and if he only receives 5 years in prison for taking the life of Officer Rosenblum, and taking a plane full of people. Who actually pulled the trigger and ended Robert Rosenblum's life is still not known. Hill has given many interviews to both the US media and Cuban media. In some interviews, he takes responsibility. In others, he blames one of his accomplices. Both Goodwin and Finney have passed away. Finney in 2005 due to cancer. If he's ever brought to the United States, he'll be the only one of the group to face justice. Officer Rosenblum's friends and family are still campaigning to have Hill brought back to the US and face the consequences of what he did. His daughter only has one memory of him, and his son was too young when he passed away to remember him. Number 2. Jose Fernando Corona and Maria Corona had been married for almost 25 years and had 6 children together when her life was taken in a disturbing and twisted act. For 13 years, Jose Corona had been on the run from authorities and remains a fugitive. Corona had no criminal history, and the police reported that they hadn't even had to respond to calls to the family home in Lewisville, Texas, up until April 26, 2010. But family and friends knew everything wasn't perfect at the family's home. 5 years before the terrifying crime, Corona had made a scene at his daughter's quinceañera, accusing his wife of cheating on him. He had no evidence that Maria had done anything of the sort, but he was very paranoid about it. Corona later promised he would never touch alcohol again, and blamed his outburst on the drinking. He kept that promise, but his suspicions about his wife continued. Corona had made vague comments about sorting things out between himself and Maria, but the comments gave the children cause for concern, rather than hope that they might go to marriage counseling or something more civil. He had told one of his daughters that he had wanted to do something for a year, and now nothing would stop it. When she asked what he meant, he just asked her to take care of her younger siblings if anything happened to him. The family would soon find out exactly what he meant by the comments. Around 11 a.m. on the morning of April 26th, a mail carrier arrived on the street where the Coronas lived. As he stopped outside a neighbor's house, he spotted the body of a woman close to the drive. It was a terrifying scene, like something out of a horror movie. The mail carrier called 911, a call that would not be released to the media. Around the same time, Freddie Arlano received a phone call. Freddie was Corona's son-in-law, married to the couple's oldest daughter, Carla. Both he and Carla lived with Maria and her husband, but were out picking up her daughter from school at the time the crime had occurred. The call came from Corona, but was confusing. He said he had finally done it and confessed to taking Maria's life. He said he was going to take her body to a neighbor's home. The couple rushed home where the police had already arrived. What Corona had said was true. Maria's body was beside a neighbor's driveway, and it was clear it had been taken from the Corona home. On the bed of a truck in the family's driveway, the police found the 2 weapons used in the attack. Corona himself was nowhere to be seen, though. Even before they had heard about the phone call, the police suspected that Corona had something to do with the crime. There had been no witnesses to the actual act. Neighbors had heard the sound of weapons being used, but no screaming or shouting. Nobody had come to investigate. But with Corona missing and no obvious suspect in sight, it seemed like a logical conclusion. The phone call seemingly confirmed that. A Toyota SUV was also discovered to be missing from the family home. It didn't take long for that car to be discovered, though. 2 days after Maria's body, the police located the SUV in a parking lot in the Dallas-Fort Worth suburb. There was no sign of Corona nearby, and no clues as to what he could have done after this point. Initially, the police believed he may be elsewhere in Texas. He had family connections in many parts of the state, as well as some family members in the surrounding states. It seemed possible he was hiding out there, and local authorities called for federal agents to help in the search. It soon became clear that he was no longer in the country, though. Shortly after the crime, there were reports that Corona had changed clothes and traveled to a used car lot. There, he asked to take a 1991 Ford Ranger on a test drive, but he never returned. He traveled to Laredo, Texas, near the border with Mexico. There, CCTV cameras captured Corona in the stolen car passing a checkpoint. Corona hasn't been seen or heard from since. The nature of Corona's crime made it one of the most disturbing and horrific that Louisville had ever seen. Maria was survived by 6 children and a family that adored her. Even with Corona's paranoia, many couldn't understand how someone could do something so terrible to someone that they claimed to love. It's not known if he'd been under the influence of alcohol at the time. If there were any open containers of alcohol found at the scene of the crime, that information was never made public. Given he had spoken to his children about finding a solution to his problem, it didn't seem as if he had suddenly snapped either. The truth about why he did what he did may never be known unless Corona is caught. The case was featured on the TV program America's Most Wanted, where the host said that it was the most vicious crime of the year and one of the most heartless he had ever heard of. Despite the spotlight being put on Corona, it didn't lead to any new information being called in about the case. The case went cold almost immediately. Maria's family believed that Corona is being hidden by his own family members in Mexico. According to the couple's daughter, his side of the family had never liked Maria. Nobody from Corona's side of the family has appeared in news reports appealing for him to hand himself in. But it's also not been proven that Corona is hiding out with relatives. Some believe he may no longer be alive. Given his comments to his children, he knew what he was going to do meant that he would no longer be around to look after them. That could simply be because he would be a fugitive, or because he didn't plan to live any longer after he committed his crime. If that is the case, no body has ever been found. Corona hasn't yet been featured on any FBI fugitive lists, but he remains a most wanted criminal. Anyone with information on this case can contact the Louisville Police Department tip line at 972-219-8477 or Denton County Crime Stoppers at 800-388-8477. Number 1. For 8 years, the FBI has been searching for the person responsible for taking the life of John Jacoby in 2015. John's passing was the first such crime in the small town of Windsor in over 8 years and shook the community to its core. The crime took place on the morning of May 18, 2015, on County Road 15 in Windsor, Colorado. For years, the town of Windsor had been recognized as one of the safest places in the country. There was very little violent crime, and it generally seemed like a pleasant place to live. The Jacoby family had been part of the community for at least a generation. John and his 2 brothers were both born in the town, as were John's 2 sisters-in-law. John was well known in town and well liked. The 47-year-old man had a learning disability that caused cognitive problems, though few in the community knew how much he struggled. They saw an outgoing man who loved to talk about the local football team or NASCAR. He was a big supporter of the local fire departments where his brother worked, and helped out in the community as much as he could. He earned the nickname the unofficial mayor of Windsor. Even those that didn't know his name knew him by sight, riding along a bicycle with a trailer pulled behind it. That trailer usually had equipment for the maintenance jobs that he did around town. On the day of the crime, John was on his way to one such job. He was going to the home of a friend to do some yard work and riding along the quiet country road 15. Today, the road is relatively busy, but at the time, traffic was usually pretty light. It wouldn't have been unusual for John to not see anybody during his ride. When John was just 35 yards from the street where his friend lived, someone pulled up alongside him and attacked him. The attack wasn't seen by any witnesses, but shortly afterward, a passing motorist spotted John's body at the side of the road. He was still on his bike, though it had fallen over. He'd been struck by 2 bullets, but that wasn't clear at the time. The incident was called in as a hit and run, and police and EMTs descended on the scene. One of the first responders was one of John's brothers, who tried in vain to save his life. The police were quickly able to determine that this hadn't been an accident, and it wasn't an automobile versus cyclist crash, as it had first been suspected. A few days after the incident, the police confirmed that bullets had struck John. Crime was relatively scarce in Windsor, which made it easy for people to connect this crime to a series of other attacks that had been happening in the area. At 11:15 p.m. on April 22nd, a young woman was struck in the neck by a bullet as she drove home from work. The incident happened just a few miles away from where John had been attacked on Interstate 25. The woman had noticed a dark-colored car pull up alongside her, then felt pain. At first, she believed she had been in a traffic accident and pulled to the side of the road to call 911. It was only once the emergency responders arrived that she realized what had really happened. Luckily, the bullet hadn't hit any vital vessels and the woman survived, though naturally the incident was terrifying for her. It was one of many similar incidents in the area. Someone or a group of people were firing projectiles into cars, shattering windows. The first such incident happened 36 hours before the woman was attacked. At 11:15 a.m. on April 21st, an inmate transport van was hit while traveling on the I-25. The passenger side window was shattered. However, as more and more vehicles reported similar incidents, it seemed unlikely someone had been specifically targeting the prison van. Thankfully, nobody other than this woman had been hurt, but that seemed to be down to luck rather than any skill on the criminal's part. They didn't appear to care whether they hurt someone or not, and it only seemed like a matter of time before that luck would run out. John's case differed from the other incidents. He wasn't on the I-25, but nearby, and most significantly, he wasn't driving a car. But when police analyzed bullets found at both John's crime scene and that of the woman, they found a match. The same weapon had been used in both incidents. No bullets had been recovered from the other incidents, so it was impossible to know if the other cases were connected. John and his family didn't know the woman who had been attacked, and there were no obvious connections between the two people, other than the fact that they had both been in the wrong place at the wrong time. More tragedy hit the community a few weeks later. On June 3rd, in nearby Loveland, two people were attacked in separate incidents. One man passed away, while the other was left fighting for his life. He managed to make a recovery, but the person responsible was still at large. The law enforcement looked at whether the four incidents were all connected, but there was only enough evidence to connect two pairs of incidents. The June 3rd crimes appeared to be separate from the crimes that had happened in Windsor. There was still room for speculation, though. With few clues to go off of, law enforcement turned to the community for help. The victims who had survived were only able to give a vague description of the vehicles involved. The person behind the attacks was never seen and couldn't be described. Residents were proactive in trying to get to the bottom of the case, and a flood of tips came in for both the June crimes and those that took place in Windsor. Finally, in March of 2018, a man was arrested for the June 3rd crimes. Christopher David Parker is still awaiting trial in that case, having been declared unfit to stand twice. But there was nothing to connect Parker to John's case. In the years since the crime took place, there have been fewer and fewer tips submitted to law enforcement. John's memory is kept alive in Windsor. His family has raised money for charities in his name, and there are a number of memorials dotted around the city. If someone who lived in Windsor knew the truth about what happened to this well-loved man, they would have had to face that every day. It's possible, though, that the person has left the Windsor area, if they ever lived there at all. The FBI is offering up to $50,000 as a reward for information that leads to a conviction in this case. There's no description of the criminal to go off of, but law enforcement has urged anybody with even the smallest piece of information to come forward. It could be the clue that leads to the whole case being cracked. Tips can be reported to the Northern Colorado Shooting Task Force at 970-498-5595. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.